She didn't ask for the keys. She held out her hand and waited like I was a valet who had forgotten his place. That moment, my son's rehearsal dinner. 40-some guests at the long table. Candles lit, wine poured. That's when I understood exactly what kind of woman my son had chosen to marry, and what kind of man my son had become. My name is not important. What I am is 63 years old, widower, retired general contractor who built a company from a truck and a toolbox into something that employs 240 people across 4 states. I'm the kind of man who got up at 4:30 in the morning for 30 years so that my son would never have to. That turned out to be a mistake. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My wife, Donna, passed 11 years ago. Breast cancer, caught late, gone fast. 19 months from diagnosis to the day I stood in the rain at Oak Hill Cemetery and watched them lower her into the ground. My son was 17. He took it hard, and I overcompensated. I know that now. I gave him everything she would have wanted him to have, and some things she would have told me not to give. I filled the space her absence left with money, and money is a very poor substitute for a mother. By the time my son turned 30, he was working in the acquisitions department of my company, making a salary that reflected my love for him more than his output. He drove a truck I leased. He lived in a condo in the River North neighborhood of Chicago that I owned free and clear and let him use rent-free. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself he was finding his footing. Donna would have told me I was enabling a grown man to remain a boy, and she would have been right. He met her 2 years ago at a charity gala, the kind my company sponsors every year because my PR firm told me it was good for the brand. She was 28, worked in marketing, had a smile that could stop a room, and eyes that, I later understood, were always calculating the distance between where she was and where she wanted to be. My son called me the next morning and told me she was the one. I had never heard him sound like that about anything, so I was glad for him. I was cautious, the way any father is cautious when his son moves fast, but I was glad. I met her for the first time at a dinner at my house in Hinsdale. She arrived in a dress that cost more than my first truck, and she spent most of the evening asking questions about the company. Not about me, not about my son, not about Donna. About the company. What was our annual revenue? Were we publicly traded? Did I have a succession plan? I remember thinking, she is thorough. I gave her credit for that. I should have recognized it for what it was. The engagement happened fast. 8 months in, my son called me from a jewelry store in the Gold Coast and asked how much he could spend. I told him to pick something that suited her and not to worry about the number. He spent $14,000 on a ring. I wired the money the same afternoon. Then the planning started. My son called me in March and said they wanted to get married in October. Fine. He said they had found a venue, a restored estate in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, capacity 250, rental fee $48,000 for a Saturday. I said that seemed like a lot. He said she had always dreamed of that place. I said okay. The catering quote came in at $91 per head for 160 guests. The florist estimate was $19,000. The photographer and videographer package was $11,500. The band, not a DJ, a 12-piece band, was $8,000 for the evening. Every time a new number landed in my inbox, I forwarded it to my accountant and reminded myself that this was once. This was the only wedding my son would ever have. I told myself that. Her parents. And I want to be clear that I have nothing against people who struggle financially. I was broke for the first half of my life. Her parents were not in a position to contribute. Her father had been out of work for 2 years following a back surgery that went badly. Her mother cleaned houses 3 days a week. When the subject of expenses came up at a family dinner, her mother looked at her plate and her father looked at my son and my son looked at me, and I understood what was being communicated without anyone having to say it. I said I would cover the wedding. Her mother exhaled. Her father shook my hand for longer than was comfortable. I did not begrudge them that. What I begrudged came later. In August, my son came to me with a request that his fiancée had, he used this word, suggested. She had suggested that, given they were starting their life together and Chicago real estate was so expensive, and given that I had that extra property sitting empty, and here he looked away from me, they were wondering if I would consider letting them have the condo in River North. Not lease, have. Signed it over. I set my coffee down. I said, "The condo in River North is not empty. You live in it, rent-free. I pay the HOA fees, the property taxes, and the maintenance. That arrangement ends when you don't need it anymore, not when you decide you want to own it." He said she felt that it wasn't fair for me to hold that over them. I said I wasn't holding anything over anyone. I said it's my property and I'll decide what happens to it. He said she thought I was making it hard on purpose. I told him to go home. Not angrily. I just told him to go home and to think very carefully about which conversations he brought back to me and which ones he closed before they got to my door. He went home. 2 weeks passed. The subject didn't come up again. I assumed it was settled. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant in Geneva, Illinois, private room, 42 guests, dinner and open bar. I had rented the room, ordered the food, picked the wine. I had written a toast that I'd spent 3 evenings reworking because I wanted it to be something my son would remember. I got there early and helped the staff arrange the centerpieces the way the coordinator said they were supposed to go. She arrived with her parents and 2 of her bridesmaids. She was wearing a dress the color of champagne, and she looked beautiful. I will give her that. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who knew how to present herself in a room. We were seated. Drinks came. I was at the head of the table, my son to my left, his fiancée beside him. Her parents were down the table, nearer to the middle. The room was warm and the noise was good. The kind of noise that means people are actually talking to each other, not just performing. About 40 minutes in, she leaned across my son as if he weren't there and said, quietly but not so quietly that the people nearest to us couldn't hear, so I thought we could revisit the condo conversation before tomorrow. I'd love to go into the wedding knowing that's settled. I looked at her. I looked at my son who was studying his bread plate. I said, "This is not the time or the place." She said, "I just think it's important to have clarity going in." I said, "We have clarity. That condo is my property." And then she held out her hand. Palm up, fingers slightly curled, the way you hold your hand out when you are certain something will be placed in it. She said, "The keys, then." "Just the keys, Den. Just the keys tonight. We can handle the paperwork after the honeymoon." The table had gone quiet in that particular way. Tables go quiet when everyone has heard something and is pretending they haven't. I said no. She said, "You're really going to do this tonight?" I said, "I'm not doing anything. You brought this to this table. I'm declining." What happened next happened fast. She stood up. I thought she was leaving. I thought she was going to make a scene by walking out. And then her hand came across so fast, I didn't even have time to register it before I felt the sting of it on my left cheek. Not a slap the way you imagine a slap. It landed hard, and the sound of it in that quiet room was like a book hitting the floor. The room went completely silent. My son grabbed her arm and said her name once, low. Her mother made a sound I can't describe. Someone's wine glass went over. I stood up slowly. My face was burning. Not just from the slap. I am a 63-year-old man who built things with my hands for 3 decades. I've had people try to cheat me. Sued 2 of them and won, and I have never, not once, been struck by another person as an adult. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair. I said to the room more than to anyone in particular, "Enjoy the dinner. It's paid for." And I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time. It was a cold night for October in northern Illinois. There was frost forming on the windshields of the other cars. I turned the heat on and I sat there and I thought about Donna. I thought about what she would have said. She had a gift for clarity that I never had. She could walk into a situation and see it whole, the way I can read a set of blueprints but could never draw a curve freehand. She would have said, "You already know what you need to do. You're just sitting here waiting for it to feel different than it does." She was right. Even from 11 years away, she was right. I took my phone out and made 4 calls. The first was to my attorney, Martin, who picked up on the second ring because I have never called him after 9 p.m. without it meaning something real. I told him what had happened. I told him what I needed. He said, "Give me until morning." I said I would. The second call was to my accountant. I told him to pull a full accounting of every financial instrument currently attached to my son: salary, car lease, the condo, the health insurance supplement I'd been covering since he aged off my policy, the Amex Black card on my account that I'd added him to 6 years ago. I said, "I need a number by 7 a.m. He said he'd have it. The third call was to the venue coordinator for the following day's wedding. I told her I needed to understand the cancellation policy. She told me. I told her I would be in touch. The fourth call was to my son. He picked up immediately. I could hear voices in the background, the rehearsal dinner still going. I wondered briefly if she was still there or if she had gone somewhere to be angry alone. My son said, "Dad, I'm so sorry she was upset and she—" I said, "Don't explain it to me." He was quiet. I said, "I want you to think very carefully about what you say in the next 2 minutes, because this is the conversation that's going to determine a lot of things." He said, "Are you canceling the wedding?" I said, "I haven't decided. I have decided that tomorrow morning you and I are going to sit down without her present, and you are going to look me in the eye and tell me whether you want to be my son or her husband, because after tonight, I am not in the business of being both those things to the same person." He said, "That's not fair." I said, "Go back inside. I'll call you at 7. I drove home. I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen that Donna and I had renovated together 22 years ago. The kitchen where my son had eaten every breakfast of his childhood, where I had read his school reports and signed his permission slips and watched him grow from a small, solemn-faced boy into a man who could sit at a dinner table while someone struck his father and say nothing. And I drank 2 cups of coffee and waited for the morning. At 7 I called him. He came to my house alone at 8. He sat across from me at that kitchen table, and he looked, for the first time in several years, like the boy he used to be. Pale, uncertain, a little afraid, not of me, but of what was coming. I asked him one question: "Did you know she was going to bring up the condo last night?" He looked at the table for a moment before he looked at me. Then he said yes. That was the answer. I didn't need any others. I told him I was not canceling the wedding. I told him that what happened last night between me and his future wife was between us, and that I would handle it the way I chose to handle it on my own timeline. I told him that the wedding was paid for and would go on as planned, because those vendors had done their jobs and the guests had bought plane tickets, and none of them deserved to be punished for choices they didn't make. But, I said, there were going to be changes, effective today. I told him the Amex card was being removed from my account. He had until end of business to transfer any balance to a card in his own name. I told him the car lease would not be renewed when it expired in January. He had between now and then to make his own arrangements. I told him I was retaining the condo. He could continue to live there at my discretion, meaning at a rent that I would determine, or he could find other housing. I would give him 90 days to decide. I told him his salary at the company would be reviewed, not cut, reviewed, by an independent HR firm and adjusted to reflect his actual position and output, not our relationship. He sat with this for a while. Then he said, "She's going to be furious." I said, "I know." He said, "She's going to think you're punishing her." I said, "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm making adjustments I should have made years ago. What happened last night simply clarified the timeline." He asked if I would be at the wedding. I told him yes. I told him I would stand in the front row and watch my son get married, the way any father does, because he was still my son, and I still loved him. And none of that had changed. What had changed was the terms under which I was willing to fund a life that did not value the man funding it. The wedding was at 4 in the afternoon. The estate in Lake Geneva was genuinely beautiful. I will give the venue that. The trees along the approach had gone full gold and orange in the October cold, and the light that afternoon came in low and amber the way it only does in the Midwest in autumn. Like the world is trying to be generous before it goes dark for the winter. I walked in alone. I sat in the front row on the groom's side, which was my right. People greeted me. I was polite. Her parents sat across the aisle, and her mother looked at me once, quickly, and then looked away. Her father stared straight ahead for most of the ceremony. My son cried when he saw her at the end of the aisle. I want to say that honestly, he cried and it was real, and for a moment I saw the boy who used to fall asleep on the couch watching Cubs games with me. The boy who called me from a payphone at summer camp at age 11 because he was homesick and didn't want the other kids to see. The boy I would have burned down the world to protect. I did not cry. I watched. After the ceremony, during the cocktail hour, she found me near the bar. She was flushed from the ceremony and the champagne someone had put in her hand, and she came to me with a look I had not seen before. Not the cold calculation of the rehearsal dinner, but something more complicated. She said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "Yes." She said she didn't know what had come over her. She said she'd been so stressed about everything coming together, and she knew how it must have looked, and she was sorry. I said, "I accept your apology." She visibly relaxed. She started to say something else, something about moving forward, about being family now. I said, "I want to be clear about something, because I think clarity is what you came to me with last night, and I think you deserve the same in return. The apology is accepted. What happened between us is done. But the things I said to my son this morning are not going to change. The condo is mine. The finances are going to be restructured. Those are punishments. They're just the reality of where we are." She looked at me for a long time. The relaxation was gone. She said, "He told you I knew about the condo conversation being brought up." I said, "He did." She said, "And you're still here." I said, "He's my son. I'll always be here. But what I'm here has changed." She walked away without another word. She went to find my son, and I watched her put her hand through his arm and lean her head against his shoulder, and I thought, whatever they build together, they will build it themselves, as it should have been from the start. The reception was good. The band was worth every dollar. I gave my toast, the one I'd spent 3 evenings writing, and it was for my son, and it said the things I actually felt, which was that I had watched him become a man, and I had not always done right by him in that process, and that I hoped the life ahead of him was one he had genuinely earned and genuinely loved. People told me afterward it was a beautiful toast. My son hugged me briefly and said thank you. His voice was unsteady. I patted his back the way fathers do. I left at 9:30. The band was still playing. The dance floor was full. In the parking lot, the same frost as the night before was starting to form on the cars. I buttoned my coat, and I stood there for a moment in the quiet, and I thought about the fact that Donna had been gone 11 years, and I had spent 11 years trying to give our son what she would have given him, and I had misunderstood completely what that was. She would not have given him money and property and a salary cushioned by sentiment. She would have given him resistance. She would have given him the dignity of having to figure things out on his own. I couldn't give him back those years, but I could stop taking them from him going forward. I got in my truck and I drove home. The roads were empty. The trees along the highway had already gone bare. Just a few days of wind and the gold was gone. Illinois does that. It gives you the color for about 2 weeks and then it's over, and winter comes and you either made peace with it or you didn't. On the Monday after the wedding, Martin had the paperwork ready. I had the Hinsdale property formally appraised. I had the terms of the condo use drafted as an actual lease agreement. Fair market rent, standard terms, nothing punitive. My son signed it 6 weeks later without comment. The Amex was cleared. The car situation resolved itself. He bought a used Honda Accord, which was the first car he had ever purchased with his own money in his 32 years of life. I did not comment on this. I noted it privately, the way you note a thing that should have happened long ago but still matters when it happens. His salary, when the HR firm reviewed it, came down 22%. He did not fight it. I think, somewhere underneath everything, he had known for a long time that the number was not real. He calls me on Sundays now. Sometimes she gets on the line and we are civil, and occasionally something more than civil. A joke, a real exchange, something that suggests that underneath the calculation there is an actual person who might, in time, become something to me. I don't know. I don't spend time predicting it. What I know is this. My son called me last spring to tell me they were expecting my first grandchild, due in August. When he told me, his voice had in it something I had not heard in a very long time. A kind of settled weight. The voice of a man who knows that something real is coming and is braced for it in a good way. I didn't say much. I said, "I'm glad." I said, "Your mother would have been beside herself." He laughed a little. He said, "I know." Then he said quietly, "I'm sorry, Dad." For more than just what happened at the dinner. For a lot of it. I said, "I know you are." That was enough. I have a photograph on my desk of Donna and me, taken at a job site in 1987, both of us in hard boots and hard hats, squinting into the sun. We look young. We look like people who had no idea what was coming, and also like people who were capable of handling it. She has her hand on my arm. I am laughing at something she said. I look at it sometimes when the weeks are quiet and I think about the long, strange way a life travels from where it starts to where it ends up. I think about what I built and what I failed to build and the difference between the two. I think about the night in a parking lot in Lake Geneva with frost forming on the windshields and the sound of a 12-piece band coming faint from inside, and the particular silence of a man who has finally stopped waiting to feel differently than he does. I made my peace with it. That's all any of us can do. There's a photograph on my desk of Donna and me from 1987. We're both squinting into the sun on a job site, hard hats on, boots muddy. We look young. We look like people who had no idea what was coming, and also like people who could handle it when it did. I look at that photograph sometimes and I think about the long distance between who I was then and who I became over the next 35 years. Not the professional distance, the company, the properties, the contracts, the other kind. The distance between a man who understood that hard work produced real things and a father who somewhere along the way decided that love meant removing every obstacle from his son's path before his son even knew the obstacle was there. What happened at that rehearsal dinner was ugly. A woman struck me in a room full of people because I would not hand over something that was mine. That is the plain fact of it. But if I am being honest, and at 63, sitting in a kitchen I've owned for 22 years, I don't see much point in being anything else. The conditions for that moment were built over a long time, and I helped build them. Not the entitlement in her, but the vacancy in him. The 32-year-old man who sat at that table and looked at his bread plate while someone hit his father had been shaped by decades of a father who loved him too softly to let him fail. That's the part that stays with me, not the sting of the slap. The image of his eyes going to the table. There is something I have come to believe, not from any book or sermon, but from watching the way things actually play out over time. Character is not inherited, and it is not given. It is built by friction. By consequence, by the slow accumulation of moments where a person is required to stand on their own and figure out what they are made of. When I cleared every obstacle for my son, paid for his car, his rent, his salary, his life, I was not expressing love. I was denying him the very process by which a person becomes someone worth knowing. I was stealing from him dressed up as generosity. What I did in the weeks after the wedding was not revenge. I want to be clear about that. Restructuring his salary, converting the condo to a real lease, ending the Amex. Those weren't punishments. They were, finally, the truth. The truth of what a man earns and what he doesn't. The truth that no one walks through this life carried, not forever, not without cost to the person being carried. He bought a used Honda Accord with his own money. I didn't say a word about it. I didn't need to. That car meant more than any lease I'd ever signed for him because it was real. He made a decision, weighed a cost, and lived with it. That is how a person builds something durable inside themselves, not from what they're given, from what they choose and what they carry and what they refuse to put down, even when it's heavy. His voice on the phone when he told me about the baby coming had that weight in it. The good kind. The kind that means a person has started to understand what their life actually costs and has decided to pay it. I don't know yet what kind of father he will be, but I know he stood in my kitchen that morning and told me the truth when a lie would have been easier. That counts. That's the beginning of something. I think about Donna. I think about what she would have made of all of it. She would have had things to say to me that I would not have enjoyed hearing. She also would have understood, I think, that the moment a person decides to stop protecting someone from reality is not a failure of love. It is sometimes the fullest expression of it. The frost was forming on the windshields when I left the reception. The band was still playing inside. The trees had already gone bare. I drove home on empty roads and I thought whatever they build from here, they build themselves. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like exactly the right thing.